Now we're coming to a passage today that is actually quite controversial. So controversial that there have actually been critics throughout history who have used this one passage here to attack the Christian faith. And that is because when this passage is first read, it almost seems to contradict Jesus' sinless nature. After all, Jesus does call this woman here a dog in verse 27. And therefore, on face value, you can understand, can't you, why these critics have made these sort of conclusions about Jesus. And it's an issue that we will address today. However, despite the fact that we will address this issue today, this issue is still, at the end of the day, just a complete distraction. Because the thing that Jesus is really wanting us to focus on here in this passage is actually this woman's faith. And it's a faith that is not just any old faith for us to look into. No, take a look at what Jesus says to this woman at the very end of this event. Matthew actually records it for us in his account. Matthew 15:28 says this. Jesus says, "O woman, great is your faith." What's amazing about this statement from Jesus here is that this is actually one of the highest commendations that Jesus gives to a person throughout his whole ministry. This is a very rare moment. And therefore this whole story here, this whole passage is clearly about Jesus trying to show us a visual representation on what great faith looks like. It's supposed to be a visual representation on how we are all to be today as his children. And therefore we will explore that today. Now, from the time Jesus began his ministry, back all the way in Mark chapter 1, verse 14, all the way through to where we are now in Mark chapter 7, verse 23, it has all been about Jesus' Galilean ministry. And that is because every single event that has happened so far in the first 7 chapters of Mark's Gospel have actually all taken place in and around the region of Galilee. And that is because Galilee is actually the place where Jesus decided to initially begin his ministry. However, what we're now seeing here in our passage today is that for the very first time in Mark's Gospel, Jesus and his disciples are seen leaving Galilee completely in order to travel to a completely different place. And not only are they leaving Galilee completely, but from now on, from chapter 7 until the very end of Mark's Gospel, you barely read about Jesus doing anything in Galilee ever again. And that is because at this stage of Jesus' ministry, Jesus' Galilean ministry has now come to an end. Jesus' Galilean ministry has now served its purpose. And therefore it's now time for Jesus to move on to the next phase of his ministry by travelling to a completely different place. What place does Jesus travel to here initially? Well, let's read where Jesus travels to here initially in the opening verse of our passage today. Verse 24. And from there Jesus arose and went away to the region of Tyre. Now, what is really interesting to see here is that Jesus isn't just leaving the vicinity of Galilee for what seems to be the first time in Jesus' ministry. No, he's even leaving the borders of the country of Israel completely as well. Tyre was not part of the country of Israel back then. No, Tyre was part of a Gentile country called Phoenicia, which is actually modern Lebanon today. A very strange trip for Jesus to make here. What does Jesus do when he first arrives here in Tyre? Well, verse 24b tells us. Verse 24b. Jesus entered a house and did not want anyone to know. Now, from this passage alone, it's very hard for us to know the exact reason for why Jesus has left Israel to make this trip to Tyre. However, based on how focused Jesus' ministry is on his 12 disciples specifically over the next few chapters of Mark's Gospel from chapter 7 to chapter 10, it is therefore very likely that Jesus has made this trip to Tyre purely because he just wanted to travel to a foreign land where he wasn't as famous, where he wasn't known about as much, so that he can concentrate specifically on his ministry to his disciples without any distractions. And therefore, because of this, when Jesus and his disciples first arrive here in Tyre, it seems as though Jesus' plan here in verse 24b is just to get to this particular house as quietly as possible so he can hide away in there with his disciples without any distractions. However, what we see in the next part of this verse here is that this plan to hide away in this house, it doesn't seem to quite work out. Verse 24c, yet he could not be hidden. Incredible. This was the level of impact that Jesus was already having on the whole world. That he can even travel quietly into a distant land that he's never even been to before, outside of the country of Israel, and yet he still couldn't keep himself hidden from the people living here in this place called Tyre. Just incredible. And as we move on to the next verse now, what we see is that Mark now introduces us to a woman who was one of these people here in Tyre who flocked around Jesus. And this is what Mark had to say about her. Verses 25 to 26. But immediately, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syro-Phoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Okay, so this Gentile woman here notices Jesus. She then rushes towards Jesus and then, quote, fell down at his feet. A sign that she already, at this stage, deeply honoured and respected and admired Jesus. And then after falling down at Jesus' feet, it also says here that she, quote, begged Jesus. She begged Jesus to come and heal her demon-possessed daughter. How does Jesus respond to this woman? Well, initially, according to Matthew's account of this event, Jesus doesn't actually respond at all. Let's read what Matthew has to say. Matthew chapter 15, verse 23. But Jesus did not answer her a word. However, what we see as we keep reading through Matthew's account is that this woman just does not take no for an answer. Matthew's account tells us that she just continues to beg Jesus over and over and over again until finally she gets a response out of Jesus. And this is Jesus' response to this woman. Verse 27 back here in Mark's Gospel. Jesus said to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now we're at the controversial part. So let's work our way through this verse very carefully, and we're going to go through 3 steps so that we don't misunderstand this statement from Jesus. All right, step 1. We have to first figure out here what is meant by the word dogs. Now, the original Greek word for the word dogs here actually means little dogs, which was the word that was always used when referring to a household dog or a pet dog, and was never the word that was usually used to refer to a wild scavenging dog. And therefore, this is a really important detail in order to help us understand this illustration from Jesus. Because back here in Jesus' time in the first century, household dogs were actually a thing. And these household dogs often positioned themselves under the dinner table at family meal times because the leftovers from the family meal times would often be given to them. However, the important thing to note here is that these household dogs only received this food from the family after the family had already eaten. They ate second. Therefore, the illustration that Jesus is trying to paint here is this. You've got a family sitting around the dinner table. You've got the children sitting around the dinner table eating their meal. And you've also got these household dogs who are sitting under the dinner table waiting patiently for their food. All right, that's step 1 done. Let's now move on to step 2. Step 2, We now have to figure out here who the children represent in this illustration and who the household dogs represent in this illustration. Now, it's actually not that hard to find an answer to this question, because Matthew, in his account of this event, just flat out tells us who the children represent and who the household dogs represent. According to Matthew, in his account, the children sitting around this dinner table are the Jews, the people of Israel, and the household dogs sitting under this dinner table are the Gentiles. So it's a matter of race, isn't it? It's a matter of race. All right, that's step 2 done. Let's now move on to the final step, step 3. We now have to figure out here what this illustration means. And to answer that, it's helpful to read Jesus' response to this woman again. Verse 27 again. Jesus said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Now, did you notice the underlined word first in Jesus' response here? What Jesus is trying to say there with that word is that the children at the dinner table must eat first, and then the household dogs can eat after them. Like I mentioned before, back here in Jesus' time, there was always an order as to who ate first. The children of the family, and then the household dogs. And therefore, overall, what Jesus is trying to say here with this illustration to this woman is that while he is on this earth, his particular ministry is to the Jews first, and that the ministry to the Gentiles will not come until much, much later. There is an order as to who receives the ministry of the gospel first. Now, what we need to make super clear here is that just because Jesus tells us that there is an order here, it doesn't mean that God therefore favours the Jews more than us Gentiles. John 3:16 obviously tells us that God so loved the world. That means both Jew and Gentile. He so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son to bring salvation to all. Which means that Jesus came to save both Jew and Gentile from before the foundations of this world. There's just no favoritism at all in the gospel. Now, this response from Jesus here is supposed to be just an illustration that Jesus uses to communicate that there is an order as to who receives the ministry of the gospel first. First to the Jews, and then to the Gentiles. That is just how God planned it. After all, it was the Jews who did receive the responsibility in the Old Testament to be a light to the Gentiles. And therefore it's only natural for them to receive the ministry of the gospel first, so that they can be this light to the rest of the world. And therefore it is for this reason as to why Jesus' whole ministry, or earthly ministry, was primarily to the Jews. I mean, you can go see it for yourself. If you sit down right now and read right throughout the gospel accounts, yes, you'll come across a couple of ministry works to the Gentiles, but what you'll recognize is just how focused Jesus' ministry actually was on the Jews rather than the Gentiles. In fact, Jesus even flat out tells us that as well in Matthew's gospel. Let's read that. Matthew chapter 15, verse 24. Jesus answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Again, Jesus' ministry was primarily to the Jews. And not only that, but even when Jesus sends out his 12 disciples 2 by 2 into their own ministries, Jesus even commands them to focus their ministries on the Jews too. Let's read that as well. Matthew chapter 10, verse 5 to 7. These 12, the 12 disciples, Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Therefore, what is clear here is that right throughout Jesus' ministry, before his death, the focus of both Jesus' ministry and the disciples' ministry was on the Jews rather than the Gentiles. However, once Jesus resurrects from the dead, there is a huge shift, isn't there? All of a sudden in Matthew 28, after Jesus resurrects from the dead, Jesus commands his disciples to go out into all the world, to both Jew and Gentile, and what? Make disciples of all nations. It is now time for the ministry to the Gentiles to begin. Then, as soon as this time began, as we enter into the book of Acts about the early church, we then see, don't we, just how focused the Jews' ministry was on the Gentiles. What we're seeing here is that God's plan to bring salvation to the whole world was always designed to occur in two stages. Firstly, it was the responsibility of Jesus to take it to the Jews. And then, after Jesus' resurrection, it was then the responsibility of these same Jews to then take it to the Gentiles and the rest of the world. And as we know, the spread of the gospel has just been absolutely unstoppable ever since worldwide. Verse 27 again. Jesus said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Okay, so now that we understand this statement from Jesus, it's pretty clear then now, isn't it? That Jesus is not sinning. And it's clear here that the reason why Jesus used this particular illustration is because this woman just simply needed to know the truth. This woman needed to know the reason why Jesus wasn't freely going around and preaching and healing the sick and casting out demons in this Gentile place called Tyre. Because again, his mission was primarily focused on the Jews rather than the Gentiles. What is this woman's response to these words from Jesus? Well, let's read her response. Verse 28. But she answered him, "Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of our time today, this response from this woman here in verse 28 is a response that signifies great faith, in the words of Jesus in Matthew 15:28. Therefore, now that we have unpacked this story and have now read this final response from this woman here, what is it about this response here in verse 28 that signifies great faith? Well, I think there's two things here in this response that points to this woman's great faith. So let's look at the first one. Number one, great faith is about reverence. Great faith is about reverence. Now, based off what we've read so far, I'm sure we can all agree that this woman here clearly shows us that she has a supreme reverence for Jesus and his authority. For instance, we noticed earlier, didn't we, about this woman's body posture when she first came face to face with Jesus here in this passage. Again, according to verse 25, this woman, quote, fell down at Jesus' feet. Again, like I said before, this is a sign that this woman deeply honoured and respected and admired Jesus. Not only that, but did you also notice the title that this woman gives Jesus here in her response? She calls him Lord, which is the title that is only used to given to someone who is above you in authority. And therefore, this woman didn't just see Jesus as just another equal. She saw him for who he really was. She saw him as her Lord. However, as this woman's response in verse 28 comes back up onto the screen again, what we notice is that it's actually these first two words of her response that is the thing that communicates her reverence for Jesus and his authority more than anything else. Now, keep in mind, this woman has just been told from Jesus in verse 27 that it is not part of God's plan for his ministry to extend to Gentiles like her and her daughter. And yet her response to Jesus is still, quote, "Yes, Lord." Amazing. This woman's daughter's life was literally at stake. And yet her response is still, "Yes, Lord. Let your will be done, not mine." This woman recognized Jesus' authority over this world and therefore submitted out of reverence for him. Is this our response when we today, like this woman, also receive a no from Jesus after begging him to answer our prayers? When we receive a no from Jesus today, even when the situation is hard, even if we don't understand why, are our words to him still, "Yes, Lord"? Now, I'll be the first to admit this is a very difficult response to make. But I think we sometimes make this response even harder for ourselves, don't we? And we make this response even harder for ourselves because we sometimes allow ourselves to desire our will and our agenda to come to pass instead of Jesus' will and agenda. We struggle sometimes, don't we, to completely hand over the entire course in the entire direction over to the sovereignty of Jesus. But that's what we're called to do. For he is God. We are not. He is the King. We are not. He has authority over this world, over this universe. We don't. And in that process, we're to just trust in his justice and his goodness. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the famous Christian apologetic Nabil Qureshi, who sadly passed away from cancer at the young age of 34 back in 2017. And as we could all imagine, this period of time that he spent battling a life-threatening cancer before he died would have been such a hard time for not only him but also his wife, his daughter, and the rest of his family. However, despite how hard this time would have been for all of them as a family, there was actually a video posted when Nabil was literally on his deathbed, praying to God to heal him of his cancer. And after he'd finished praying to God for healing of his cancer, he finished his prayer with this comment. He said this, "But Lord, if it shouldn't be your will, then I trust you." This is what reverence for Jesus and his authority looks like in practice. Whether it was part of God's plan for Nabil to be healed of this cancer or to not be healed of this cancer, his response to God, like this woman's response, was still, "Yes, Lord." However, having reverence for Jesus and his authority isn't just limited to us saying, "Yes, Lord," whenever Jesus allows hard times to come our way. Now, reverence for Jesus also means that we say, "Yes, Lord," to even his commandments as well. Because after all, Jesus is Lord and King over every part of our lives, isn't he? And yes, we're obviously not saved by his commandments anymore. No, we're saved by the cross. But Jesus still calls us to uphold his commandments as Christians, even today still, doesn't he? And yes, sometimes it's not always easy to obey his commandments throughout our Christian walk. But no matter whether we feel like it or not, a true sign of reverence for Jesus and his authority is when we still, out of reverence, say, "Yes, Lord," to his commandments, and then go out into the world to fight to uphold them in our lives today. For again, great faith is about reverence. Great faith is about reverence. That's number one. Let's now move on to number two. Great faith is about humility. Great faith is about humility. Let's read this woman's response again, focusing this time more on the second half of her response. Verse 28 again. "But she answered him, 'Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. I was reading an article recently by Randy Alcorn, who is the founder of a ministry called Eternal Perspective Ministries. And in this article, he gives a really helpful biblical definition of humility. He said this in his article, quote, "This is what humility is. It's recognizing who we really are." You see, humility is not about you seeing yourself as lower than who you really are. No, that's obviously nothing but a low self-esteem. That is not what some people today think is humility. And at the same time, it's also not you seeing yourself as higher than who you really are. No, that's obviously pride. Now, according to this definition of humility here, humility is about you seeing yourself for who you really are. And who are we exactly? Well, we are sinners. And according to God, we sinners are not worthy. And the only thing we are worthy of today is eternal judgment. That is who we really are and what we truly deserve. And that's exactly how this woman saw herself. Now let's read her response again. Verse 28. "Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Now, I want us to put ourselves into this woman's shoes for a second. Jesus has literally just said to her that like a household dog, she needs to sit under a table and wait patiently. And yet this is still her response. Not only does she say, "Yes, Lord," to these words from Jesus, but she even goes as far as associating herself with this household dog who is now, in her own words here, begging for dirty food crumbs. Wow. There is only one way a person can genuinely associate themselves with the lowliest things, such as a household dog's begging for dirty food crumbs. And that is if a person correctly sees themselves for who they really are, as a sinner who is not worthy. That is how this woman saw herself. And it is this response here is the only response that can come from a person who possesses true humility. When we look out into this world today, what we notice is that it's literally filled with people who have a false belief that they are humble. And the reason why they view themselves in this way is because the world today is constantly telling us an incorrect definition of humility. The world is telling us today that humility is about believing that we are all equal, that we are no better or no worse than anybody else around us. That is not what humility is. Now, according to this definition here, humility is about you seeing yourself for who you really are. Yes, a person could very well and truly believe that we are all equal. After all, equality is a very common fad today. However, if at the same time that person believes that they are higher than who they really are, then they are seeing themselves in a prideful way. If they're seeing themselves as higher than what God tells them they are, then they are seeing themselves as a person who deserves more than what they truly deserve. And that is because they are seeing themselves as good people. And that is why seeing yourself as a good person is the most prideful attitude that you can have in the presence of a holy God. Humility is only found when we, like this woman has here, correctly see ourselves for who we really are, as sinners who are not worthy. And it's only when we see ourselves in this way can we truly humble ourselves enough to see our need for salvation in Jesus and thus come to a saving faith. For again, great faith is about humility. And that's how we Christians are to continue to see ourselves today throughout our Christian walk, especially when we accidentally fall into the trap of starting to think that we are worthy of certain things. Verse 28 again. Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. How does Jesus respond to this woman's words to him? Well, let's read verse 29. And Jesus said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." Now, even though Jesus initially says no to this woman's request because his ministry was genuinely focused on the Jews rather than the Gentiles, I still think that Jesus still had every intention to heal this woman's daughter. I think Jesus saw this great faith in the heart of this woman and he just wanted to test it first. He wanted to test this woman's faith by not only delaying his response initially, but by also responding with an illustration that he knew would require some serious reverence and some serious humility to be able to accept. And therefore, this woman's response here in verse 28 shows us, doesn't it, that she did have the required reverence and humility needed to be able to pass this test of faith. And therefore, Jesus commends her for it here in verse 29. Let's read verse 29 again. And Jesus said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." Or according to Matthew's account of this event, Matthew 15:28, then Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." Jesus, because of this woman's great faith, ends up giving her the crumbs of his ministry by healing her daughter of this demon possession. However, even though this woman is a sinner like us who is not worthy of even the crumbs of Jesus' ministry, what is amazing is that Jesus is still not content with giving her just the crumbs, is he? But Jesus desires to give the whole human race everything. And that's why he went to the cross, didn't he? So that we, all here today, like this woman here, can receive the ultimate gift, the greatest gift that we sinners who don't deserve anything could receive. Eternal life. And such mercy we have been shown in that.